So as for the controller, we're going to see that later on. But what we don't have yet is another very crucial part of creating editors for content parts, and that is called a driver. So if you think about what's available in MVC for model, view, and controller, basically a shape is what corresponds to a view. The model, shape corresponds to kind of, the template or the shape corresponds to kind of the view. The model is usually your content part, and in Orchard terms, you can kind of say that the driver is corresponding to a controller. So the driver decides what kind of shapes to display, and then the content part is going to be the model that you use. Not necessarily, but that's kind of a general idea if you want to, kind of compare what's happening in Orchard and what's happening in MVC. So Orchard is just another layer on top of this architecture. Actually, let's clean up the usings. Clean up the usings like this. So we're going to have another folder to our project. Usually, you can tell how complex an Orchard module is the number of different folders that you have inside them. But a couple of very, very common ones are drivers, models, views, services, sometimes, and then you can have a bunch of other ones if you want to arrange you want to organize your code nicely. So let's add the new folder called drivers. So this is the current folder structure we have right now in our modules. Okay, so in the drivers we're going to add a new class, and it should be person list part driver. So like I explained that your content part is your model. Well, you can say that rather the shape is your model, and then it ties into MVC templates. So kind of it's rather not parallel, but like a V shape. So how it connects together, MVC and Orchard. But anyway, person list part driver is kind of the same thing for a content part as a controller relates to a normal model object. So let's add person list part driver, and I'm actually going to delete this part and use a snippet called oDriverFull. So this is another snippet from the Orchard Dojo library, and there's a ton of code here. So let's see what we can do here. And we're going to take a moment to look at what's going on here, because this is quite important. So this should be called the file name or the class name I defined earlier. It should be person list part driver. And actually, it's quite interesting to see that this is the only thing basically I need to define. We're not going to, I don't think, we're going to actually care about import and export here. So let's just type one of the properties here. So if you remember, person list part has two properties that we have defined as hybrid infoset properties. So I'm just going to type in one of them and hit enter. So this is most of the code. This is the usual set of code or set of functionality that you need to add to your driver. And this snippet is really, really useful to bootstrap all these, because there's not much more that we're going to add here. So it's really useful to have this, just given to you. So let's add the missing usings, like person list part, content part driver, and if you add the usings for content part driver, then you will see that most of these are working. You also need to add iUpdate model. Yeah. And the context objects from the orchard.contentmanagement.handlers namespace for export content context and import content context. So let's go ahead. We're going to fix this build error a bit later. So let's go ahead and see what's happening here. So when you are working with the content part, there's basically two things that you can do by default. One of them is define how to edit the values in the content part, and then define how to display them. And you have two editors because you know, when you are writing a regular MVC controller and then you have a view pass on some model object, you usually have two methods in the controller, two different actions that are connected together. One of them usually correspond to a get request, the other one for a post request. So first you display the editor and then you save the editor. That's why you have two different methods. This is the same concept here. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the display method. This is really easy. What happens here is that we have generated some default names for our content shapes called parts underscore person list. So the shape names can't have a dot in them. There's a specific kind of convention that dots will be replaced with underscores. Hyphens are going to be replaced with two underscores. So let's leave it like this. We're going to modify it a little bit, but not now. Yeah, the editor is basically defining that whenever you want to edit a person list part, this is the name of the shape that is going to be generated. This is the name of the template that is going to be used for that shape. And since this uses the shapehelper.editor template method, it needs to go into an editor template folder inside the views folder. So we will see that in action. And then, of course, we have the post version of the editor. So this is basically the get version. This is the post version. And basically, what happens here is that we are using the model binder to update the parts properties based on what was posted. And this is the method that is going to run. It's going to update the content part properties from the request and then return to the editor method that displays the editor. And at that point, if updating the properties were successful, so let's say you don't have a validation error or you don't have another exception coming from the content handler, for example, then you're going to get the editor you're going to see the editor again, but with updated values. And if you take a look at what's below, then we also have the exporting and importing methods. So if you remember what happened on one of the first sessions or in the first, maybe third of this course, we talked about import-export. And this is the way for you to define that my content part has some specific properties. I want to be able to import and export. And this is the way to do it. So let's just define what to export and how. And this is kind of this is the regular code that you will need to have. So the reason this element is initiated as par.definition.name is to make sure that when you have a row in the XML in the recipe that is going to be exported from Orchard, you will have a row, an XML node with the name of your content part, and then each of the properties you define here is going to have a separate attribute, and of course the value of the attribute is going to be the value of the property. So, and this is how you define each of those attributes and values. So this is going to be the name of the attribute, this is going to be the name, the value of the property, or the attribute actually. So let's send another one. Well, it's easier just to copy paste one. And let's call it max count, because that's the other property we want to be able to export. And then for importing, we will need to do something well, a little bit more, because in this case we are actually transmitting strings. So Orchard knows that whatever value this property has, whatever type, in the recipe, in the XML format, it's always going to be a string. So it doesn't really matter what type it is, because it's going to end up as a string. But if you want to import a string and then put it into a value like an enumeration or an integer, then you will need to convert it, because Orchard doesn't know by default how to do that. You may want to have some additional logic depending on the string input, how to convert it to another type. So let's add some helpful code here. So as you can see, in this case, the value is a string, so that's why I have a type mismatch, right? Because this is an enumeration of a specific type that we have created. So we're going to use enum.parse. It should be the same type, and then like this. And hopefully it will recognize what I want to do. Oh, sorry, yeah, of course. So enum.parse. So okay, so now we have defined how to import our property of our custom enumeration, which requires some parsing. So the next thing we are going to do is do the same for our other property. I think it's easier to just copy paste this one as well. This one is of the type max count. And by the way, when you saw that we are declaring an element and setting some attributes on it, and the element should be the same name as part.definition.name, this part name corresponds to the same thing. So Orchard will know that this is the XML node that I'm going to need to access. And then these are the properties. Okay, so it should be part.maxCount equals, and it's easier a little bit. In this case, we just need to use in.parse. Well, if you want to play safe, you can do try parse, but it's if you have a value that's 400% sure that's an integer because that's how you created it, and then export it and then import it, then in.parse is going to be fine, and you don't need like managing errors and do try parse and catch exception or whatever. If you edit a recipe by hand and make a mistake, like typing a very long integer and then putting a character and letter character in the middle of it, then of course this is going to fail, but you shouldn't really do that. Okay, so let's go back here where we are actually doing some more work. So what we're going to do is show you some ways how you can actually manipulate how your shapes are displayed, do some additional work inside. So if you want to calculate something whenever a shape is displayed and then use the data inside the shape, then the way to do it is not to do it here just in the driver. You should encapsulate it, kind of, that's not quite the right word for it, but enclose it in the shapes declaration. So we're going to use another syntax here. I'm just going to delete it and type it back again where I need it. So we're going to use the combined method here. So what happens here is that if you want to have a display method in your driver and you want to actually return multiple shapes, which you can do, by the way, so surprise for you, you can actually return multiple shapes and then place them in different places even, or just after each other, but they do something different. You may want to disable one or two in certain different scenarios. It's up to you. It's very flexible. Really, sky is the limit to the customization. So let's return combined, and then, actually you can do this. It's not going to do anything, but let's do something useful. So the first thing we're going to return is something which is a content shape. So if you take a look at content shape, this is a content shape result, which is one of the classes that you can actually return as a driver result. Combined is actually a combined result, which is also a driver result, so it's compatible. So the content shape needs to have basically, well, first of all, it needs 2 parameters by default. One of them is the name of the shape, the other one is the shape's declaration. So first parameter, or you can just return a shape itself, but we are actually give our shape a name and then define how it's actually built, because we're going to add some customization into it. So the shape type is the name of the shape that you can refer to it. This is a technical name, and it has the convention I explained earlier with replacing dots and hyphens with underscores. So it should be parts underscore person list. And then we're going to have our func of dynamic factory, which means that we were going to define a lambda expression which returns a dynamic object. So that is going to be actually the shape. So the shape is a dynamic object because it can have basically any kind of structure, properties, or methods. Whatever you want to attach to it, you can do that. That's why it's dynamic. So we have a lambda expression with no input. And what's inside is, let's calculate some interesting details. Well, not so interesting, but just for the sake of the example, is take the name of the display type, which is an incoming parameter here, and then convert it into uppercase, which is extremely useful. So this is something that you will use in all of your projects, I'm sure. So yeah, it's pretty easy. What you do is display type dot to uppercase, or just to upper invariant, whatever. So language invariant, and then you will return. We will actually create the shape and then return it. So the content shape method needs two parameters: the shape type and the shape itself. So this is where we actually create the shape, and we use shape helper for that. So that's, as you can see, it's also dynamic. So I think we have seen the shape helper with ad hoc shapes in one of the introductory, maybe during the theme development tutorials. So this is the factory where you can actually create your shapes, and you can define here what kind of parameters to pass into this. So let's take a look at. So we're going to create a shape with the name parts person list. Okay, and we're going to pass some parameters, which is display type, which is one of the parameters of this display method, and then upper display type. So now that we have actually calculated what's the uppercase version of the display type, we will use it for something useful, very useful in a way, for the sake of demonstration. And that's it. So we have two parameters, or we have actually two values passed into this one. Okay, and that's it. And since we want to return different, oh yeah, we also need another one here. Okay, and so we have created one shape. You can actually put only one shape in a combined result if that's what you want to do. It doesn't really matter. But we are going to return two different content shapes. So the reason we're doing that, basically, this one of them is well, kind of a demonstration for this one. The other one is going to be something actually useful. So we're going to create another content shape of the name parts person list summary, and then we're going to use the that looks like a smiley or a sad smiley, and then we're going to use the shape helper again to actually generate this. And what's interesting here is that Orchard is going to do some plumbing by default, so you will always have access to the, if you are using content shape, you will have access to the content part object itself. So you will be able to access the properties of this content part when you are generating shapes for it. And this is summary. Well, returning a summary shape only. Well, actually, we are returning a normal shape and the summary shape. So the difference is with the display type. So later on, we will take a look at, well, not so later, but maybe in 10 minutes, we will take a look at the placement. So if you are displaying a content item, And when you are displaying a content item, you usually display content parts as well. So for your content parts display, you can define what kind of details to show the user based on different scenarios. So let's say you are listing many content items of the same type, but not necessarily the same type. If you have a lot of data inside the content items, you may not want to show all the data when you are listing like 10 or 15 or 100 content items. Just a summary for the user to be able to decide whether they want to see more or not. So that's what summary is for. It's one of the built-in display types, or basically built-in, and this is one of the default display types. But you can define your own, so you can have as many as you want depending on the scenario. And this shape is going to be the same for details. So when you are actually looking at that content item in its full, then the detail display type is going to be used. And that's what it's for, to show all the data. So we are returning both of these shapes, but it doesn't mean that they will always be displayed at the same time. We can actually decide later, like I explained in the placement, we will see that, when to display those. And you can actually say that you want to display both all the time. You can say that in this case display this one, and in that case display that one. Okay, that's it, I think, for the display method. And actually the editor and the update editor or the updating editor methods are perfectly fine like this. So, you know, this kind of bootstrapping that we have here is really useful, because usually this is what you want to do with your content parts when you are displaying the editor or updating the editor for it. Of course, if you want to add some additional logic for validating data, you can do that here. That's not so different. So that's something that you can check out but we are not going to cover this right now. It's not that important. Maybe what you want to take a look at is the two parameters here that are null. This is really interesting. So if you want to tell Orchard that some of the properties shouldn't be updated or shouldn't be validated, you can do that. So as you can see, include properties and exclude properties are the same, are the two last parameters of the four, which are defined as null here. But you can actually pass in a string array for both of them. Whenever you pass in some value for include properties, only those values will be evaluated by the model binder and updated in the content part. And then same goes for exclude properties. So if you have exclude, then that is going to be taken into account. If for some reason you have some property or your content part that is not for data storage, but you still have it on the form for some reason, for a hidden field, for example, for some validation, or I don't know, whatever, there can be a lot of different cases. Then this is how you can tell Orchard that actually shouldn't be updated because you are doing something else with it. And yeah, please, Orchard, mind your own business. This is my stuff. So that's how we tell it. Okay, so our editor class is mostly ready. So like I told you a couple of times, now we're going to jump into placement.info, or a placement file. So placement is actually an XML file that actually configures how and when shapes should be displayed. So just for the sake of example, you will see that in every module that uses shapes, and well, most of them use shapes. I don't think if there's, well, maybe the very, very low level ones are not working with shapes. But let's take a look at taxonomies, for example. So if taxonomies has a placement.info file, and this is how it tells that when you are displaying a taxonomy field, if it's summary, then it should be this shape. Well, this might not have been a very good example because it uses the same shape. Actually, this would mean that if you have a taxonomy field and you use your own display type, then the taxonomy field won't be displayed. For some reason, whoever wrote the taxonomy module decided to do this. So yeah, that's it. it's an XML file, so we're just going to create our own and customize it. So let's add a new item to our module. And I'm going to set the scope to this because it's easier. So let's add a new item. I think maybe text file is easier. Yeah, let's add an empty text file, but it should be called placement.info. And that's it. Now we have an empty file called placement.info. It doesn't really matter if you call it a lowercase or uppercase p. We usually type it uppercase. So a placement.info file, like I explained, is an XML file where you configure how and when to display your shapes. And the root node of this XML document is called the placement. And Visual Studio is clever because if you do this, you type this, then you can close the file, open it again, and you will have an XML highlighting. So it's a little bit easier to edit. And so if you want to declare that a shape should be displayed all the time, well, not all the time. We're talking about an editor shape in this example, and that's only going to be displayed whenever we are building the editor of the content item. Then this is how you do it. So you say place. This is the XML node that you will use, that you will have to use. And if you want to declare multiple shape placements in one place node, then you can do that. We usually like to organize the code very similarly. I mean, in XML, like a placement, as we do with code. So this is kind of syntax I like to use. So the place and then at the same column, the closing element. So it's a self-closing element. This is kind of up to you how to organize it, but I think it looks neat. So we're going to actually declare that we have shapes called, we're going to go to the driver. So we have a shape called parts person list edit. So I'm just going to copy paste it. So each of the shapes that you want to place are a separate attribute on the same place node. And the value is going to be the placement itself. So what you can do here is define a zone and then define the position inside the zone. So let's say we have parts person list edit, which is the editor shape of the person list part. And we're going to say that whenever you are displaying an editor, which includes, whenever you are displaying an editor of a type that has person list part, then the person list part editor should be at the position 5 inside the content zone. So by content zone, I mean this is a local zone, so this is not exactly the same concept as the zones inside the theme. So the zones inside the theme are called global zones. When we are talking about zones here, these are actually local zones to the content item. So you can divide up a content items editor or display into separate zones, and content is there by default. So you don't need to care about creating it because that's always there, but you can have your own ones. As many as you want, you can call them as however you want. And those are going to be technical names, but you know that's very useful. So you can organize your shapes in any arrangement as you wish. And another thing we're going to do is displaying parts person list. And this should also go to content 5. So that usually some of the fields, content fields, have higher or actually lower, so later placement by default. Some of the content parts have higher placement, so content 1, content 2. Usually title part should be at the first position, so that usually has a lower number. Author part is kind of the same. Okay, and so we are continue with our placement, and the next thing. So we will define the placement for all our shapes. As you can see, we already have 2 of them covered, and in the driver we also have a third one, which is parts person list summary, and we only need to display this when the display type is summary, because that's why we created this shape. So we're going to have a match XML node here, or placement node here. And the match needs to have an attribute as well. So in itself, it doesn't really make sense. And quite interestingly, it can have an attribute called display type, and we're just going to say that display type should be summary. So whenever I declare a shape inside the shape placement inside this one, it will only be activated. The shape will only be displayed when the display type is summary. Okay. So let's just create another place element here, and it should be parts person list summary. And for the sake of consistency, let's just put it in also the 5th position in the content zone. Another thing that you can add to your match element is content type. So you can say that person list. But you know, if I were to include all these inside the match content type person list declaration, I'm going to, well, remove all this code, so it doesn't really matter to arrange it nicely. But if I were to do this, then it would mean that my content part display and editor shapes can only be used on this specific content type. So if for some reason, and this is kind of against the extensibility principles of Orchard, but if for some reason you have a content part that can only work with one specific content type and nothing else, then that's the way to do it. Well, that's kind of one of the ways to do it. But it really doesn't make sense, because you may want to have your own, some of your users, for example, when you're developing a module, they may actually want to create a new content type and reuse the functionality that you have implemented with your content part. And, well, that's really easy to do, because if your content part is attachable, like ours, as we have declared it in the migrations, but it can be changed in the admin UI, then they can attach this content part to another content type, and then that piece of functionality of your content part is going to be used in other types as well. So let's not do that. Another thing that you can do here is match for the path. So let's say you want to display a shape at a specific type, like /admin/my-module. So if you have your, I don't know, controller, you have your own admin controller, and it generates some shapes, or it generates some shapes for some reason, and you want to display them only at that specific path, then you can actually do that. Or if it has some route values and you want to match all of that, then you can say /*. So this will say that /admin/my-module/ whatever else. So this might be also useful. Let's say that if I am going to admin my module and whatever route value comes after, I want to hide the shape, because there's some other module that actually places a shape in the content zone or whatever zone for a type or for a part. But I have my own controller that builds some editor or display shapes through a content part or through a content item. But this also involves displaying some specific shape that I want to hide. Then the way to do it is to say that place parts I don't want to use this, and then the placement should be just hyphen. So this will mean that whenever I am on this path, /admin/my-module and whatever other route values it has, the shape that is called parts I don't want to use this is never going to be displayed. And the way it's evaluated is that if you have module dependencies, then the leaves or the leaf elements in your dependency tree are going to be stronger than their parents. And that's kind of a natural way to build on the extensibility of Orchard. So let's say that this is a third-party module or built-in module, that this is a shape provided by a third-party module and or a built-in module, and you have your own module that depends on that one. Then this placement is going to be stronger. It's going to override the placement than what's in the other module. So that's how you can involve. That's how you can create more involved scenarios with modules, with dependencies between modules, and make them work together. Okay, so now we have our placement. We told Orchard how to place the shapes for editing and displaying person list part. So we are actually finished with this one. And the next thing really is just to create some shape templates, which are MVC views, basically. That's why we're going to put them in the views folder, not so surprisingly. And those are going to be actually connected. So the driver is what makes the connection between the shape and the shape template. So that's why it's kind of similar to a controller in the MVC paradigm. So let's create 2 files which will have the same name, but they will have in a different folder. So let's go to views, add a new folder called editor templates. And this specific technical name might be similar to you because this is what we typed here. Well, not exactly. Because it says editor template, and we have created a folder called editor template. But yeah, whenever you declare in an editor that you are creating an editor template, if you put it in the editor templates folder, well, you have to put it in the editor templates folder, and this is the actual template name. As you can see, the parameter tells it. If you create a view with this name, then the driver will actually make the connection between the shape and the shape template. So let's create. I usually create new HTML file because if you use these menu items like create new MVC5 view page, sometimes it hangs Visual Studio for me for some reason. So I usually just create an HTML page and then just change the extension, the file extension. So it should be named parts.personList. It's just person list. Okay. So I don't need this one. And I'm just going to close all the things I don't need here. So parts.personList.cshtml. So now actually Orchard recognizes that this is a Razor view template, which is really neat because I'm going to need, of course, Razor highlighting because it makes my life easier and yours too. So what you do is, and this is MVC basically, is to declare the type of the model object that you're going to have in your template, and it should be Dojo course to that module dot models dot person list part. And when I said I have highlighting, I wasn't right because I need to reopen the file, but now I have. So. Or maybe not. Like this, sorry. So Dojo course to that module. So for example, why does it? Oh, okay. Actually, what the Visual Studio does is a good thing. So let's do that. Now I see why. And so let's create a new MVC5 view page, and let's call it parts.personList. And what's happening in the background is Visual Studio is updating the NuGet packages and the references for this project, because if you want to have like full Razor support when you are editing templates, then you need some additional stuff added to your projects. For some reason, it worked before for me without actually doing this, but when I did this, it usually hangs Visual Studio, so doesn't matter. Oh, actually, and there's a bug here, so this might be fixed in Visual Studio 2017. But if you have a dot in your name when you are creating this, I kind of forgot about it because I usually create HTML5, then it's going to just cut it off, and then .cshtml remains after the first dot. So it should be actually parse.personList. This is very annoying if you don't spot this error at first, and then you just say that, okay, I got a huge blue screen of error where my driver says that, okay, I want to create this shape with that template, but that template doesn't exist. Yeah, because the file name is wrong, because Visual Studio messes with the file name. So we have our empty CSHTML file. We have Razor editing support. And yeah, I was worried for a second that what kind of errors can Visual Studio find in an empty CSHTML file, but none of those. So yeah, we are happy. So let's create, let's type it again. So Dojo course, oh, now we have full syntax and IntelliSense, which is really neat. So this template is going to use personList part as the model. So what it means, well, it's basically the same as MVC. So it's MVC. And so what we're doing here is creating the template for the editor. That's why we are in the editor templates folder. So let's create a nice editor with some actual, proper semantic structure and T-strings. Have you covered T-strings? So personally settings, because in this shape we are actually defining the editor for those properties that define the filter parameters for our person list. So we can filter on, well, only one property, sex, and we can also define what's the maximum number of items we can display in a person list. So that's what we're going to create an editor for. And this is a nice structure. So we are creating an order list, and the first element should be, and we're going to use here the helpers that are providing. So html.label4, and the first parameter is an expression. So MVC knows that we want to, obviously we are working with the model object here in some way. That's why we declare that the personList part, the type of our model object is personList part. So whenever we are adding HTML helpers to access and interact with some of these fields, we can use these HTML helpers and generate basically the UI through these methods. So it's easier than just typing HTML, because actually MVC will generate these very nicely. And it's going to be syntactically correct, and there's actually a connection between them. That's label4, for example, is very useful for that. So we're just going to say model dot sex, that's it. And then we're going to actually say that we are using this other overload of this method. So that's that's provided by Orchard, which also accepts a localized string. So that's the label that we actually want to display. And this is a T-string. But since we are inside a Razor block here, as you can see, it's not just HTML, then we don't need the @ sign as we saw in the other file, for example. I'm just going to jump back here. So we are displaying a label for this field. Now we're going to generate an editor for it. And if you have an enumeration, you can use like radio buttons. Now we're going to just generate a drop-down list. So as you can see, we can use drop-down list 4 and model. So this is just very simple bootstrapping. And for the select list, we need to define what kind of options we can select in this drop-down list. So let's create those. Yeah, and we are using an array initializer here. A select list can have items of the type select list item. And the select list item can have 2 properties, maybe more. It can have multiple properties, and we have IntelliSense, of course, so it's really neat. Text is going to be the text that is going to be displayed in a drop-down list for each of these items. And we also, use these strings here because we want to make sure that whenever our module is used in a multi-language environment, then it can be translated properly. and we don't have this included. So I'm just going to say using Dojo course to that module that models dot person. No, sorry, that's it. We can actually remove this one as well now. Okay, and we can say this is mail dot toString. Oops. Okay, and we obviously, well, today not so much obviously, but now we have two options. Should be enough for now. But yeah, just to be, correct, now you can actually have more options. And the other one is female. And the value should be like this. Okay, so now we have, oh, come on, don't screw up my code. Okay, so now we have defined the drop-down list for this field. What we are also going to add is through another HTML helper, which is validation message. So if well, in this case you don't really need it because the select list item doesn't have a default value, so you always have one of these values selected. But for the sake of demonstration, it's important for you to know that you can do this. So the validation message is going to be displayed when you have a validation error on one of those fields. And when you display a validation message for a specific field, then that's where the validation message is going to be displayed. And the way you define actually a validation error is in the driver when you are updating the editor. So you can say updater.add model error. So let's say I have detected that one of these values provided by the user is wrong. For some reason, it can. There's no easy way to define this on the UI because first of all, when you are doing validation, you should do it in the client side first. But whatever validation you do, because it's easier for the user to get feedback about their input, right? If you have some wrong, like maliciously formatted data or just wrong type of data, you don't need to post it to the server to be able to define that data is wrong. You should always do validation on the client side first, but you should never expect the data posted to the server 100% correct, even if you have client side validation, because the user can mess with the form, like F12, open the developer tools, modify your form and post something else. So you shouldn't guess, and you shouldn't be 100% sure that the data that is posted to the server is 100% right if you have client-side validation on it. So users can be, well, they can be just wrong or I don't know, screw up something or something is rendered wrong in their browser, but they can actually be malicious and try to harm your server or attack your application in some ways. And the way to do it is to define the name of the property for the key and then display an error message. And the error message is what's going to be displayed in the validation message as we are creating here. So it should be model.text like this. And that's it for this field. Okay, so the next field, or actually the only field that we're going to add in this editor as well, is going to be for the max count property. I'm just going to copy paste these because it's easier to just rewrite what we have here. So that's for max count, and it should be maximum number of persons to display. Max count should be added here as well. So yeah, actually we could have validation on the max count property in the driver, and if it's a negative value, then obviously, or we could have it as an unsigned integer, and then it should be, so it can be handled different ways, up to you. So, and what we need here is to have just a text box. So there's no, or actually what we could also have, we have an input well, let's do that. I think that's better. So we could use html.textbox and define, basically have the same body, expression body, but it's actually nicer, and we don't have a helper for that to generate a field for entering only numbers. So yeah, and we're going to take a look at how you can tie this together still with label for, because actually html.label and label for differs in a way that whenever you click on the label, it will put the input focus inside the field. So that's using the ID of the HTML element. So it should be so it has a minimum value. Yeah, it should be 1 at least, because displaying a negative number of items doesn't really make sense, and 0 as well. If you want to display 0 items, then don't display the content item. So whatever. And let's say ID, and this is what we can. This is where we can use html.id for, and this way the label will still be able to find this input element. So it should be model dot. Come on. Did I mix it up? Oh, it should be okay. Okay, let's see. It should work. Okay, so that's it. We have we also have a label. We also have a validation message, and basically by defining a custom input field of the type number with a minimum value of 1, we basically have client-side validation built in. So that's really neat. Let's go ahead. And the other thing we're going to do is create another shape template, which is called person list. Well, the name of the template is going to be the same, but it's going to be at a different place. So I'm just going to copy paste it because it's easier. So copy paste parse.personlist.cshtml into the views folder as well. And then we're just going to go ahead and, remove most of it. Okay, so let's start with declaring a razor block here. And we're going to add an element which is, let's add the using rather. I like that better than typing a namespace. So using Dojo course to, I need at Dojo course 2.module.models, and that's it. And it should be of the type personalist part, so we are casting this object. So we are casting model.content part. So what happens here is that, so I actually closed the driver for some reason. So if we go back to personalist driver, what we're going to see here is that we have, in the display method, we generate 2 shapes, parts person list and parts person list summary. Okay, and actually I think I might have made a mistake. Sorry, I have to cheat to make sure that I don't. No, okay, it's fine. So we are going to create. So we are creating actually 2 shapes, but Orchard knows that the part needs to be included in this process somehow. So whenever you create a shape with the shape helper, the content part object is always going to be available. So it's going to be appended to the shape itself, and you are able to access it through model.content part. So now we actually have the content part that is actually the same instances here as we have here in the driver. Okay, so let's see. We have let's display some text. One of the things that we can do is display t-string, like explaining what the user is actually looking at. So let's add the t-string here, and remember that we actually added some properties like display type and upper display type. So let's use those to make sure that we can still access it. So you are looking at a person list content item in, and we're going to add some parameters. So the first is going to be, the display type, which is available because we have added it here. And we're going to also display in between, after the read display type, the upper display type, because we can do this, but should we? Doesn't matter, we'll do it anyway. So upper display type. So this is just a demonstration that these properties are really available for us. Okay, next is, and well, let's put it in an H1. And let's place an H2 as well. And we're going to use t.plural. And we're going to display how many persons are there in the person list. So t.plural, first parameter is text singular. So just say that there is one person. Second parameter is the plural version of the same sentence. So there are whatever number of persons, and then the parameter, or actually the number that actually defines whether I should use the singular or the plural version. So what should be that one? Well, we have the content part here, so we have saved it into a variable, so we don't have to do this, casting all the time. We have the part variable here, so part.persons. You remember that's the output of our lazy field. So part.persons.count. We have link U available here. So that should be the number that defines whether I want to display the string there is one person or there are a certain number of persons. And then since we want to use this number to display it, not just to determine the singular or plural string, we will just copy paste it. So this parameter defines whether we want to use the singular or the plural version, and this parameter is going to be injected here, or inserted rather. In this case, since we are using a normal T string, not a plural one, model.display type is going to be inserted in the position 0, at position 0, and this is at position 1, this one. Now, there's nothing else, but display the actual persons that we want to show the user. So let's just go ahead and add an unordered list, and then for each through all the items par.persons. So our lazy field actually makes sure that whatever filter parameters we have. Well, there's only one filter parameter actually. So whatever value our filter parameter has, we will have those persons that match this parameter loaded with the maximum number of items that is displayed, that is defined by the maxCount property, and then we can just iterate through them and display the name of those persons. So this is just normal Razor syntax. So let's build our solution just to be sure, but I think we made sure also that whatever we did here is compatible with dynamic compilation, so it would work probably, but not to make any unnecessary mistakes. Sometimes it's useful to just rebuild your solution. Okay, so one thing I wanted to add is a slight mistake. So I left out some important parameters from the initialization of the drop-down list. So if we go back to the editor, so person list part in the person list part editor in the editor templates folder, there's two other things we need to add here. So if you take a look at the overloads of creating a select list, there's this overload where you define two strings, data value field and data text field. So data value field should be value, because that's the name of the property that defines the values of each select list item, and well, the other one is pretty obvious. So text is what defines what is going to be displayed in the actual drop-down list. So now, if we go to the admin area, refresh the page and go to person list, then you will see that we have an actual editor here, which is working. You can use the title part. As you can see, I already did some testing here, so I know test person list. Autoroute part is going to be automatic. The URL is going to be automatically generated from autoroute part. We don't want to set it as a home page, but anyway. And here's person list settings, right? So this is what we have been working on here. And as you can see, if I click on this label here, then this drop-down list is going to receive the focus. So if I hit space, it's going to open up. So I can select a value. And then if I hover over the label for maximum number of persons to display, then as you can see, it will the number, the input field of the type number is also receiving focus. So if I click here, I can enter some value, like, I don't know, not this much, but maybe 10. And as you can see, since this type is of the accepting numbers, we also have these up-down controls here. And since I defined that there should be at least one as the value, you can't go any lower than that. So that's really neat. We can actually take a look at the HTML output. Well, it's going to be quite similar to what I typed. But as you can see, this part here, HTML ID for model.maxCount is going to generate this. And this is the same as in the for attribute of the label. So that's why it knows that whenever I click on the label, the focus should be put into the number field. So that's it. It's really easy. And if I hit save, there's going to be an error. And the reason for that is that we have defined the route values in the handler to display, to edit one. So our intention was not exactly to use the editor in this way from the new section. So that's why it's redirecting us to Dojo course 2.module/contents-admin/person-dashboard/37, which is the content item ID, because that's the editor route value we have defined. So in the next session, in the next part, basically we're going to create a controller to manage these person list items, which is called the person list dashboard, and it's going to have another set of functionalities that are quite interesting with interacting with content items and the admin area. So that's what's coming up next.